Welcome to Was Justice Served, the podcast where we journey back in time to some of the past's most cryptic criminal cases, brought to you by Findmypast. In each episode, our experts take a look at the evidence found in our historical newspapers and records and try to unpick what really happened. We'll be looking at the gory, the heartbreaking, and the shocking cases that gripped the nation. Join us as we uncover some of history's most scandalous crimes, follow the twists and turns of the trial, and ask the ultimate question, was justice served? But don't just take our word for it. Analyze the evidence for yourself. For each episode, you can access the case files, a complete collection of the historical newspapers we've talked about, all online at findmypast.co.uk/wasjusticeserved. Before we get started, this is just a note to say that this is a crime podcast, so it will contain graphic descriptions and scenes some listeners may find upsetting. Welcome to the third episode in this series. My name is Jen Baldwin, professional genealogist and research specialist for Findmypast.
And I'm David Wilson, Emeritus Professor of Criminology at Birmingham City University. I'm an author, TV presenter. I'm with Jen, a podcaster.
It almost feels like you were forgetting your name a little bit there, David.
Well, that sometimes does. I'm quite elderly. I'm in my 60s now. I kind of forget lots of things.
We have a very interesting case to discuss today. Should we get to it?
Let's go.
Let's do it.
An unseasonal storm is rolling in late in the evening of May the 31st, 1902, in the quaint rural village of Peasenhall in Suffolk. In a large painted house overlooking the central crossroads of the village, Georgina Crisp has turned in for the night after checking the old building for leaks. A sudden clap of thunder makes her sit bolt upright in bed, listening. Was that a muffled scream and a thud she just heard, or simply the storm outside and the old house playing tricks on her? She wonders aloud to her husband whether they should check on the housemaid Rose in case the storm has unsettled her, but decides against it. Rose knows where they are if she gets scared. She hears nothing more from inside the house, settles back against her comfortable pillows, and drifts off. By the next morning, the storm has blown itself out. In the clear summer morning, 63-year-old William Harsent is walking along the road towards the Crisps' house to bring clean linen for Rose, his daughter, as he does every Sunday. He turns the handle of the back door and, finding it unlocked, goes through into the kitchen. Here, he discovers every father's worst nightmare. Rose is lying lifeless on the kitchen floor, a pool of blood around her head. Her throat has been slit from ear to ear. There is a stab wound to her chest and a deep cut to some of her fingers. Wearing just a nightdress and stockings, it is clear to see that Rose was pregnant. There are signs of scorching on her body, and much of the fabric of her nightdress has been burned away. Beside her is a broken lamp and fragments of a glass bottle, which is a mess of blood and paraffin. A shelf behind the door has also been badly damaged, and a rug has been hung against the window, as if to block the scene from view of the outside. When local surgeon Dr. Lay arrives at the house, he immediately recognizes the bottle as one he issued recently to a neighboring family, the Gardeners, who live just 200 meters away. He continues to inspect the body as his colleague, local constable Eli Nunn, reviews the scene for clues. Nunn discovers a letter in Rose's bedroom, arranging a meeting for the night before. "Dear, I will try to see you at 12 o'clock at your place. If you put a light on your window at 10 o'clock for about 10 minutes, then you can take it out again. Don't have a light in your room at 12, as I will come round the back." Rose's body is removed for a full post-mortem, which rules out the initial supposition of suicide. Just 2 days later, late on Tuesday evening, 36-year-old William Gardiner is arrested for Rose's murder.
Firstly, this is the classic country house mystery, isn't it? It's a murder, it's unsolved, it happens late at night, there's a thunderstorm, it's raining, and, and we don't know what happens.
Straight out of Hollywood.
Straight out of Hollywood. And there are also, I think, some clues. The first is that we have got defense wounds on the hands, which implies that poor Rose Harsant fought or attempted to fight off her attacker. There's a confused and chaotic crime scene because of the burning, which is inconsistent with this being premeditated. It's almost like panic has gone on in the wake of the murder, which rather makes me think, was this intended? Was this premeditated? Or is this something that I've characterized in my writing, Jen, as murder that takes place within 5 minutes of madness? So for me, there are a number of clues. I'm really pleased they ruled out suicide, because this quite clearly
not suicide.
Wasn't suicide. What did you make of it?
This slit from ear to ear thing sounds very gruesome.
Yeah.
And very sloppy in a way, but also I'm not sure, actually. Is that a sloppy crime, or is that more of a premeditated?
Oh, the slitting from ear to ear would be much more premeditated and quite professional to be able to do that, to behave in that way. But there are elements thereafter which don't suggest that this is done in a premeditated professional way, but instead the crime scene seems much more chaotic. And I think already I'm presuming there is an individual perpetrator.
Well, and we can't miss the fact, of course, she's pregnant.
Yeah.
And 6 months pregnant, even. That's quite interesting.
If this happened today, this would get solved, because no doubt we'd be able to prove whose child Rose was carrying. And also at 6 months, in a small community, Peasenhall in Suffolk. The other thing that didn't quite work for me, I mean, I'm a father of a daughter, and, dads and daughters are often very close.
But caught that too. Yeah.
The idea that he would bring linen over didn't immediately strike me as something that would be typical.
Yeah, a very domestic type chore, if you will. And if anybody was going to do that for Rose, who is now living essentially as an adult in a domestic service employment situation, it would have been her mother. But in all honesty, even that would have been rare. She would have just done her own laundry.
Yeah, so there's something there that hasn't quite worked in terms of the narrative of the story and how it's presented, and kind of, deconstructing this. We've got the criminological, and we've also got the social and interpersonal. But for me, as ever, I'm relying on you, Jen Baldwin, and all your research to tell me a bit more about the characters here and see what that might reveal in terms of what went on.
So let's talk about our characters, shall we? Yeah, let's get into it a little bit. So Rose first. Rose Harsant is our victim. She's born in 1879 in Peasenhall. Her father is a journeyman carter and named William, and her mother is Elizabeth. She's the only daughter of theirs, but they have 6 sons, so 7 children in total, all boys except for Rose.
Oh, so that also might help to explain why her father would have wanted to have delivered linen to her if she's the only daughter and he has 6 sons. You used a phrase about her father, William, though. He's a journeyman carter. Now, that's a very specific job, isn't it?
It is, but it is essentially using a cart to move things from point A to point B.
So it's like haulage.
Yeah, basically. And the journeyman implies that he's been doing it for a while. So this is, people tend to think of the lower class or kind of lower middle classes in this period as kind of unskilled and untrained. But in fact, this is something that he would have spent his lifetime kind of perfecting this. Because there is certain ways to move supplies and equipment that is more efficient, right? Especially if you're thinking about moving it by hand versus moving it with a horse or moving it with a motor vehicle. There are ways that you move bricks versus dirt that make that experience easier and better. So he's been doing this for a long time, and he's made a career out of it.
And so the 6 months pregnant within this culture, within this type of environment, there would have been lots of gossip. There would have been lots of awareness. Could she have hidden her pregnancy at this time?
Yeah, that's an interesting question I think we should delve into. The crime actually occurs on the 31st of May, 1902. So if you're thinking about 1902 fashion and the role of a domestic servant, she's working anywhere from 12 to 14 hours a day. She's working incredibly hard. Although they're in a small community and she does have family around her and there are a lot of people who know her, the life of a domestic is actually quite isolated. So I think for most of her working day, she could probably keep it to herself. But as soon as you step out of the house for errands or outdoor chores of any kind, you're risking exposure because at 6 months, you're obviously showing. So through the first couple of months, during the winter, she could have bundled up, she could have layered her clothing. But as we get closer and closer into summer, it would have been much, much more difficult for her.
And this is May when
This
she's
is the
murdered.
end of May even. So I'm thinking about, traditional or stereotypical weather in this part of the world. Maybe it's probably wet and rainy. She's probably okay. If she chooses her errand days carefully, she could probably hide it. But as she gets closer and closer to this date of 31st of May, it's going to be much harder.
I like the way you smiled as well when you talked about stereotypical weather in this part of the world, by which you were meaning Britain in that
That's
context.
right, yes.
How damaging would it have been to Rose's reputation to have been discovered to have been pregnant? How damaging might it have been to the person with whom she had had sex that led to the pregnancy?
Yeah, so I think she's kind of right on the fringe, actually, of that societal barrier. There's a point where it becomes okay for women to have children out of wedlock because it was just kind of a known and accepted thing. And then there's the other side of society where it is very much not okay, and she would have been ruined. She's just on the fringe of that group of people. So she probably would have gotten away with it, but she would have needed to get married pretty quickly.
So the big issue is, which we'd have been able to demonstrate if this was happening today, but the big issue is who's the father, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think from a reputation standpoint, Dad and Mom are probably more concerned about the pregnancy if they knew about it. There's clearly a little bit of kind of, daddy's girl happening here. I think you're right about that with the linen and the fact that she's the only daughter. But there is a perspective of protection too, as well, right? My daughter's out in the world. I still have to protect her. I'm going to check in on her every week. So there's certainly that component as well. The parents would have been more concerned about her reputation.
You very cleverly, Jen Baldwin, I shouldn't give you too many compliments this early in
Will
the
go
episode.
to my head, yeah.
You very cleverly introduced the employers, Georgina and William Crisp, and this idea that Georgina sits bolt upright in her bed because there's a thunderstorm and she was concerned about how Rose might have been. Do you think that implies that they were aware of the pregnancy? Do you think that implies that there was a much closer relationship between them than one would expect stereotypically?
Yeah, I think actually there is a very close relationship there. So Rose's employers, let's just review them a little bit. Georgina and William Crisp, they're rather well-to-do. They're rural middle class. William is a tailor and a woolen draper, so he's doing well for himself.
Yeah, and the fact that William is a tailor and woolen draper is, of course, reflective of Suffolk, the county, which was the centre of the English wool trade from the Middle Ages throughout, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. So they're doing well. They've got a good trade. If they moved to the city, they wouldn't quite be as successful. But in this country environment, they're doing great. Georgina's the daughter of a gentleman. They live at Providence House in Peasenhall, so an established estate. They're relatively elderly at this point. Georgina's in her mid-60s, and William is in his 70s and hard of hearing. So Georgina probably reacted to the storm more so than William would have just because of that hearing issue. And we know from statements given to the newspapers and in testimony in the trial that they were very close to Rose. Remember, again, she's 23 years old when she's killed. She's not a child. right? It wasn't uncommon for females to go into domestic service as young as 13 and 14 years old. So she's got 10 years of work experience. She's been theoretically out of her parents' house for 10 years. We've got an elderly couple that she works for that are very parental towards her. And this relationship kind of implies they've known each other for a very long time. Rose had conversations about her pregnancy with Mrs. Crisp. And that honesty, that transparency, if you will use that modern phrase, between domestic servant and employer was a bit of a risk for Rose. She would have had to obviously come out with it at some point, but it was more common for her to have lost her position as a result of that pregnancy than to keep it. So the fact that she's still employed at 6 months really implies that this is a good, solid relationship, and they feel quite motherly and fatherly towards her.
My parents were farmers, and we would have people come and clean. And the relationship that one establishes with people who are regularly in your home is often quite a close one. It's both close and distant.
Right.
Because there's that sense in which you have to be close, because these are people literally picking up things that you've dropped, and they're cleaning mess that you've made. So inevitably it's close, and inevitably you want to get to know, because these are people who are regularly coming into your home. But the relationship between servant and master or mistress is a much more complex one than I think has previously been noted within the literature.
Especially in this middle class situation, right? And because they only have one servant, so she does everything. So she must be treated with discipline, and she has a lot of things on her to-do list every single day. But at the same time, they are demonstrating this behavior of a very caring and nurturing environment, which rather goes against most domestic servant situations. Most domestic servants were in a house for a year at most. It was very uncommon to have many years in the same household.
So, I mean, the phrase we would use today is the precariat. You know, you're not going to be in employment for very long. You're going to lose that job. And domestic servants at this time were part of the precariat, to use that modern phrase.
Absolutely. So there's one more character, David, that we need to introduce.
And that's, of course, going to be William Gardner, the accused, isn't it?
Absolutely, the accused. So Gardner, he's born in 1866, so he's 35 at the time of the murder, just over a decade older than Rose. And he's actually born at the Blything Workhouse, which is the nearby district workhouse. He's the illegitimate son of a woman named Carolyn Gardner.
And was he married?
He was married, actually. He married a local girl, Georgiana Cady, in 1888. He works as a foreman at the local seed drill works, and he's also active in the local Primitive Methodist Church.
Now, tell me about Primitive Methodism, Jen, or what does that mean?
So Primitive Methodism is born from the revival movement in the early 1800s. This was significant in America, and some of those kind of trends and popular events kind of found their way over to England. So they're not actually that different from the Methodist Church that is popular in England at this time and the Methodist Church today in all reality. But they held to the beliefs of kind of the original Wesleyan teachings, the original Methodists. So they're very true to that original doctrine of the Methodist Church. So essentially we have a group of people who get together kind of in the forest, and they spend a good 14 or 15 hours talking about the true beliefs and the teaching of Wesley and the Wesleyan faith. They are baptized into that faith. And then they come out of the forest, and the leaders of that church go, well, actually, no, we're not going to recognize that. So they eventually form their own group, which becomes known as Primitive Methodists.
So if I think about Wesley's teachings, John Wesley's teachings, if we are describing them as Primitive Methodists, does that make them more conservative, more liberal than the Methodist Church? How would you characterize it?
It's much more about the doctrine of the church and reading it word for word versus interpreting the doctrine of the church. So they very much read Wesley's writings and his teachings as if he was sitting right in front of us and saying, this is actually how you should behave. And they go, yes, that's how I'm going to behave.
So it's very it's not like the Church of England, and it's not about having a priest, a bishop, an archbishop. This is something which is much more egalitarian. Would that be a fair word to use?
I think that's a fair word to use. I mean, you can almost picture this environment which the church has created. They're literally standing in the forest. Someone is probably standing on a rock or a box, and he's preaching from his heart, from his soul, and they are moved by his words. So moved that they agree to be baptized into this new faith, and they leave the structured church, the Church of England.
And if you are a Primitive Methodist in a small rural community like Peasenhall in Suffolk, if you have some standing within that church, does that give you a status?
It's a social status for sure. And likely the whole community was majority Primitive Methodist. It's probably why they all lived there together. There's a sense of you're doing what's right. You are an upright citizen in our church, in our community, in our village. You are a model citizen and a true believer of the faith. And so if you do your time as a leader of the church, which didn't have to be for the whole lifetime, you take your turn in that leadership role and you continue to be respected in the church.
And was our poor victim, Rose, was she a member of the Primitive Methodists as well as William?
Yeah, she was, absolutely. So she was actually a member of the choir, and she cleaned the church as well. And those details will start to come out as we get into the trial.
So we've got the accused, William Gardner, is a Primitive Methodist, and we've got Rose Harston, our victim, who is 6 months pregnant when she's murdered, and she is also in the choir at the church that William Gardner would attend, and she also would clean the church.
So they're both very respected members of the congregation.
If you're a respected member of the congregation and you've got a woman pregnant that's not your wife, that's not going to go down too well.
Not terribly well.
Not terribly well. Let's talk a wee bit about Gardner's wife then. What do we know about her?
So we just know a little bit about her, but she actually does become part of the case. So she's well known to Rose. They actually visited each other as neighbors. It seems like they were quite friendly. And she's also a member of the church. There are three people who are part of the church who know each other, live in a small village, and are part of this community.
One of the things when I was listening to the outline of the story is that I don't really know that much about Georgina Gardner in comparison to Rose, or indeed in relation to William Gardner himself. She is quite anonymous in terms of what's written about her. Was that something that you noted as well in your research?
Yeah, absolutely. And it definitely would have been intentional, right? We've talked about this in other episodes, actually, that the sense of respectability in this period is very important.
So if I've got this right, Jen, and correct me if I'm wrong, we've got our victim, who's 23, Rose. She's a domestic servant. She's 6 months pregnant when she's murdered. We've got the accused, William Gardner, who is a Primitive Methodist. He's married to Georgina. They have 8 children together. And Rose also attends the same church as the Gardners. And therefore, we've got a prima facie case here developing, haven't we? That William Gardner must have been involved in some way. And we've also got, it seems to me, and I suppose this is where my kind of background comes in, we've got the crime scene itself, and we've got the characteristics of what happens to the victim. Rose's throat is cut, but there are defensive wounds to her hands. She's clearly tried to fight off her attacker or attackers. And there's been this rather crude attempt to burn the body, which makes me feel that we're not dealing with something that is necessarily premeditated, perhaps an argument that got out of control. I'm not quite sure yet.
Yeah, it's good speculation and leads us directly into discussion on the trial. You ready?
Yes, please.
All right, so a little bit more evidence comes out of our newspapers, and so let's share that with you and see if that changes your opinion at all. We know that her throat is slit, but she also has stab wounds in her chest And as you've noted, the deep cuts on her hand from defensive wounds. There's a smashed shelf from the force of the door, kind of suggesting that she fought off that attack, right? So there's physical evidence as well as those wounds. There's no murder weapon left on the scene, but we have that bottle and the lamp where they tried to burn the body. We know the time of death occurs sometime between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. And don't forget there's that love note from the introduction that says, it's from the day before, but says leave a candle in the window and I'll meet you at midnight. So there's a little bit there that we still need to discuss, I think. And then it comes out in the trial that she does indeed have a lover of some kind. Her mother suspects that, and of course she's pregnant. But we don't know, of course, who the father of the child is. So let's set the stage. The first scenario that is very obvious, of course, is that William murders Rose. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's the obvious way to go, isn't it? I mean, he had a lot to lose if he was indeed the father. William has a lot to lose. But then what if it started as an argument? What if this started as William admits to his wife, Georgina, that he has got Rose pregnant? What if Georgina then is involved in discovering, there's going to be a light in the window, and maybe it's Georgina that goes round and challenges Rose about what has happened? And then there's also the bottle, isn't there?
Yes.
The bottle must have been something that was recognized as containing something before it contained the paraffin that the killer attempts to burn Rose's body with.
And of course, it's identified by the doctor as being issued to the Gardners.
So we've got some direct evidence that takes us back to the Gardners then.
You want another one?
Yes, please.
So witnesses in the case testified that the note that was written to Rose to meet the night before was written in William Gardner's handwriting.
Oh, well, come on. It's open and shut already, isn't it?
The note, just to remind, says leave a candle on in your window and I will come, but extinguish the candle. So it had to be someone within the line of sight of the kitchen window of Rose's bedroom.
And presumably the Gardner's house was in the line of sight.
They lived 200 yards away.
Well, what does William Gardner say? Does he deny it's in his handwriting? I mean, is that challenged in any way?
Gardner and his wife both say that's not his writing at all, and completely dispute the claim.
And how would that be given any credence? Why would that be given credence?
So in the investigation, the police actually find other letters in Rose's room, and they're quite juicy, David. They're even obscene.
Okay.
So there may be more than one man writing Rose some letters. There's a young boy in the community who actually just kind of puts his hand up and he says, I'm going to make an admission here. He is asked by Rose to write some of these letters, but the note from the night before the crime and these notes are two different handwritings.
Okay, and so the obscene letters could be interpreted as a way of making her lover, Gardner, jealous.
Sure.
Or it could simply have been she is a 23-year-old woman who lots of people are interested in dating in the local Peasenhall community. Couldn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so is there some undiscovered lover that history has overlooked would be the question.
Quite possibly.
There. But is there any direct evidence that emerges at trial that shows that Gardner and Rose had been in some kind of illicit affair?
A year before the crime, there are local rumors kind of swirling about the community, and probably quite at a pretty good pace, that Rose and William are caught having an inappropriate relationship, and it raised quite a scandal in the church.
Why did it? Well, it raised a scandal in the church because obviously Rose is single, but William is married. Is that why it raises a scandal?
It's a little bit more detailed than that.
Oh, go for it.
Right. So we have two men who say that they are going past the chapel and they overhear an intimate conversation. And so they stop and listen. And it ends up being an inquiry, actually, through the minister. And they are found together in the chapel and actually just well into it.
Are you saying they were caught in flagrante delicto
100%.
within the church in Peasenhall?
In the chapel.
Oh, wow. So
Yes.
there is direct evidence.
But this happens a year before the crime.
Okay.
So it could be that Gardner and Rose continue that relationship, but it could also not be.
So there could be another lover within the community who thinks, I don't want to be caught being the father of Rose Harsner. But we never ever get who that person might be.
Well, and if we speculate for just a second, if Gardner goes to trial for this murder, I don't really picture some other man standing up and saying, well, actually, no, that was me. And Rose's mom actually ends up testifying at the case and says, and I quote, walked out with a young man about 12 months ago and alleged that the relationship with Gardner was over a year ago. So the timeline for Gardner is a little questionable.
I mean, I think that for me, the questioning would be about whether or not William's wife, Georgina, also played a part.
Right? Is it possible that she plays a part? There's a neighbor that testifies that there were sounds of her kind of getting up through the night, and she said she had taken ill. So she was up and she was active. She was not asleep at the time of this crime. The husband, of course, his imprisonment would have meant some real drastic things and changes for this household. Remember, they have 8 children. So this loss in economic earnings would have been really severe for Georgina and her children. The knowledge of Rose and William's affair was quite widespread. It had been on the gossip mill for quite some time. So she had possible motive to kind of remove the problem from her family. So is it possible that she's providing an alibi for her husband?
Oh, absolutely, it's possible. Is it also possible that the pair of them acted in concert?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Is it possible that Georgina was just as heavily involved in the commission of the crime as William was? Although historically, and if we just rely on the texts that we've got, the documents that we've got, Georgina's never charged. Georgina's never arrested or charged for this murder.
Yeah.
It is only her husband, William Gardner, that's arrested, then charged and put on trial for this murder. Do you know, it's so sad, though, that constantly we're in... Here's Rose that's murdered. She's murdered, 23. She's carrying a 6-month-old baby. And what we see is the press and others pouring over her private life in such a way that somehow that's the mystery. So, Jen, is anybody else going to come out of the woodwork that I should be aware of before we kind of think about the trial and its conclusion?
We don't know who Mystery Lover is. That person, if they existed, is never identified. But another William arrives on the scene. This man is William Taylor. We'll just call him Taylor to try and keep this simple.
And who's William Taylor?
He is actually in prison for desertion at Dover Military Prison. But in 1904, he writes this quite detailed confession of the murder of Rose. So let me share those details with you. So he says that on the night of the murder, he's walking from Colchester via Peasenhall. He comes across this large house and he decides he wants to see what's inside that's valuable and he's going to rob this house. So he goes around the back of the house. He sees a young girl talking to a man with a dark beard, which, by the way, fits the description of Gardner. Gardner leaves and Rose goes up to bed and Taylor goes in through the back door. Rose comes back downstairs after hearing a noise that he made. So from behind, he holds his hand over her mouth, tells her to stay silent. But as soon as she lets go, he fears she is about to scream. So he hits her and she falls to the floor unconscious, thus explaining the thump that the employers hear from above. He slits her throat with a kitchen knife, rifles through her pockets, and runs away.
Okay, so a lot of that doesn't make sense, does it? It's the defensive wounds on her hand. There's a stab wound to her chest. There's the paraffin and the attempt to burn the body.
Which he's left out completely. And there were details that he missed, right? And the police noted that as well. So the house and the layout, the position of Rose's body, all of those things were either omitted or incorrect in his statement.
And you know, and as bizarre as this seems, or often in murder cases, if it's a high-profile murder, if there's a lot of press about what's happened, there will be people for various different reasons, normally their own mental health issues that have been unexplored or unexpressed by them, they will admit to crimes that they didn't commit, which is why in investigations, murder investigations, the police will deliberately hold back some details because so many people will come forward to claim unbelievably that they committed the murder. So elements of the murder and the crime scene are held back so as to be able to rule people out who will inevitably turn up and say, excuse me, but I did that killing. And I think William III falls into that category, doesn't he? And again, though, what it demonstrates is just how the press, those details in the press, allow people like Taylor to be able to try and inject themselves into a high-profile story. Inject themselves, as I say, for their own reasons. That brings us directly, therefore, back to Gardner and what happens to him at trial, doesn't it?
We've reviewed the evidence, twists and turns. Before we give the verdict, though, you know what you need to do. David, what would you do if you were sitting on the jury?
If I was sitting on the jury, I think that the person who had most to lose by his affair and Rose's pregnancy becoming known was her lover. And we have got direct evidence that William Gardner was in a sexual relationship with Rose, and therefore William would have lost his standing in the local community. So I think that, I think William Gardner was guilty.
You think he did it?
I do. Do you not?
I don't think I do. I think I'm on the fence on this one. If I was sitting on the jury, I'd have a really hard time with this case. It feels like there's too much mystery still around Rose and her life. I just have too many questions. So I don't know that I can come to a verdict on this. I'm supposed to make a decisive decision, but I'm not sure I can. Well, here's the bit where it gets a little bit trickier, I think, actually. Not that we've had enough of that so far. William Gardner's actually tried 3 times.
Well, the jury couldn't reach a decision 3 times.
They never come to a conclusive decision, and he is ultimately set free.
Oh.
You're surprised.
Of course, it would be a capital offense. Juries often didn't want to convict in capital offenses because the person who committed the murder would themselves have been executed by the state. But 3 times.
Well, and think about that, though. Take that a little step further or two. This is a small community. He's a father of 8. He has an entire family depending on him.
But what about poor Rose's family?
Yeah,
I mean, might have damaged William Gardner's reputation and how his wife and children were going to prosper thereafter. But poor Rose is still dead, and her unborn child is never born. So poor Rose is really left. You know, I hope you're going to bang your gavel and I hope you're going to say that justice was not done in this particular case, because it seems to me that justice wasn't served because no one's ever been convicted of poor Rose's murder.
I would agree with that completely. I think in this case, justice was not served. I'm not going to bang the gavel because there's no justice here. It's an unsolved case. Rose deserves to kind of come to rest.
Well, poor Rose Harsner. And do we know what happened to some of these characters, William and Georgina Gardner? Do we know what happened to them afterwards?
They eventually move into London, which of course is a very different situation, both economically and socially. And they actually live quite a long time after this.
See, I think they wanted to start a new life because they would never be able to leave behind the gossip in that community about what might have happened between William and Georgina and Rose.
They are in Southall, Norwood, Uxbridge. So they're moving around quite a lot in the London districts. And in the 1921 census, actually, Gardner is working as a building contractor. So he is taking his skills from Peasenhall and applying them to a new trade.
So those are different districts, but they're close enough. And I wonder if gossip and rumor still followed them even in London?
I think it's possible, certainly. The newspaper coverage on this case would have been national. So if someone had a long memory, they could probably connect the dots. They certainly would have had to leave the Primitive Methodist Church. They would have had to remove themselves from that community, because if they had stayed in that particular denomination, they likely would have never gotten rid of this story. And of course, those types of faiths are not as predominant in the metropolitan areas. So it would have been harder for them to stay in the church anyway, but they likely would have gone into the Church of England or some of the other larger congregations simply to help get away and separate themselves from this. William dies in 1941. He's 74 years old.
Okay, so during the Second World War?
Yeah, Georgina dies 8 years later at the age of 80. But if we think about what all has happened since then, so this crime occurs in the early 1900s. We have seen an abdication on the monarchy. We have seen, obviously, World War I, which is incredibly massive and influential over the course of the country. All of these veterans come home, if they come home, and we have a depression from an economic standpoint. We have a housing crisis that is now being lived through. We have the full interwar period, which is the start of the decline of the empire, leading all the way up into, of course, the rise of Hitler and World War II. And this couple has seen it all.
Gosh. Well, thank you for telling me about what happens to the Gardners. But I'll leave this episode thinking about Rose and her unborn child, who doesn't get to see these great sweeps of history
Absolutely.
that are going to develop in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and 40s, because someone killed her. In our next episode, we're going to be looking at the curious and sudden death that shook Southend in the summer of 1906.
And possibly in 1906, we will find a more clear-cut decision. Don't know yet, but I think there we'll be able to ask again, was justice served? All of the stories featured in Was Justice Served have been uncovered using Findmypast historical newspapers and family history records. Discover thousands of stories, untold, hidden within British and Irish newspaper pages. Delve into the rich details of your family history, and clip and save your articles in your very own collections on Findmypast.